The morning sun filtered through the high windows of Skyline Aerospace's main production floor, casting long shadows across the gleaming machinery. Robert Parker, the company's CEO, stepped through the double doors with his usual brisk stride. He hadn't announced this visit. He never did. Surprise inspections were his specialty, a tactic that kept everyone on their toes. "Good morning, Mr. Parker," called out Vivian from the quality control desk, straightening her posture as she spotted him. A ripple of awareness spread across the floor as workers noticed his presence. Robert nodded curtly. At 52, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had built an empire from scratch. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly trimmed, his navy suit impeccable despite the early hour. He'd been running Skyline for 15 years, transforming it from a struggling aviation parts supplier into one of the industry's leading innovators. "Production numbers for the JX-7 prototype?" he asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Up 12% from last week," Vivian replied, handing him a tablet with the morning's reports. "We've resolved the supply chain issues with the titanium components." Robert scrolled through the figures with narrowed eyes. Numbers never lied, and these told him that things were running smoothly, perhaps too smoothly. In his experience, comfort bred complacency, and complacency bred mistakes. "Mistakes in aerospace cost lives. I'm doing a walkthrough," he announced, handing back the tablet. Alone. The production floor was his favorite place in the entire complex, a symphony of purpose, with every person and machine playing their part. Engineers huddled around computer terminals, technicians calibrated equipment with precision tools, and assembly workers brought theoretical designs into physical reality. This was where ideas took flight, quite literally. At the far end of the facility stood their crowning achievement, the TX-5000 engine. It represented the culmination of 5 years of research, promising fuel efficiency that would revolutionize commercial aviation. The prototype gleamed under specialized lighting, its complex internals partially exposed for ongoing adjustments. As Robert approached the engine, something caught his eye. A man in gray coveralls was standing near the prototype, staring at it with unusual intensity. He wasn't wearing an engineer's badge or carrying any tools, just a mop leaning against a nearby workbench. The man's weathered hands rested at his sides, but his eyes moved methodically across the engine's components with what looked like recognition. Robert felt a flash of irritation. Skyline paid premium wages to its janitorial staff, but that didn't mean they were welcome to gawk at confidential projects instead of doing their jobs. "Hey you," Robert called out, his voice carrying across the floor. Conversations quieted as heads turned toward the confrontation. "Shouldn't you be cleaning something?" The man turned slowly. He was older than Robert had initially thought, perhaps in his early 60s, with deep lines around his eyes and gray hair cropped close to his scalp. His name badge read, Victor Mendez. "Yes, sir," Victor replied quietly, reaching for his mop. "Just finishing up this section." Something about the man's careful study of the engine nagged at Robert. It wasn't the casual curiosity of someone admiring a shiny object. It had looked almost professional. "You seem very interested in our TX-5000, Robert said, stepping closer. The entire floor was watching now, work temporarily forgotten. Victor's expression remained neutral. "It's an impressive machine." "Is it?" Robert raised an eyebrow. And what would a janitor know about jet engines? A flicker of something, perhaps pride, perhaps pain, crossed Victor's face before disappearing. "Not much, sir, just that it's important to the company." Robert wasn't sure why, but he felt challenged by the man's measured response. Throughout his career, he'd developed an uncanny instinct for when someone was hiding something. This quiet janitor with the studying eyes was definitely holding back. "Tell me, Victor," Robert said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you find our engine so fascinating, perhaps you'd like a closer look?" The janitor's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on his mop handle. "I'm just doing my job, sir, and I'm offering you a unique opportunity." Robert gestured toward the prototype. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. You can show us how this engine should be properly serviced." He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Since you seem so knowledgeable." The floor went completely silent. Even the distant hum of machinery seemed to fade away. Everyone knew what this was. A public humiliation designed to put someone in their place. It wasn't the first time their CEO had made an example of someone, though usually his targets were underperforming engineers or managers, not maintenance staff. Victor stood perfectly still, his face giving away nothing. For a moment, Robert thought he might refuse, might walk away with whatever dignity he could salvage. Instead, the older man gave a single, deliberate nod. 10 o'clock, he confirmed, his voice soft but steady. I'll be here. Whispers immediately broke out across the floor. Robert turned away, satisfied that he'd made his point, when Director of Operations Nancy Liu stepped into his path. "A word, sir?" she asked, her expression professional but her eyes concerned. Robert followed her to a quiet corner of the floor, away from curious ears. "That wasn't necessary," Nancy said once they were alone. "Victor's been with us for nearly 7 years. He's reliable, punctual, and never causes problems." He was standing, around staring at our most valuable prototype instead of working. Robert countered. "Nobody gets special treatment here, Nancy. You know that." "There's a difference between special treatment and basic respect," she replied, keeping her voice low. "The company values you established yourself state that every employee contributes to our success, regardless of position." Robert waved away her concern. "It's a harmless lesson. He'll fumble around the engine for 5 minutes tomorrow. Everyone will have a laugh, and he'll go back to mopping floors with a better understanding of his place here." Nancy didn't look convinced. "And what exactly will the rest of the staff learn from watching this? That I have expectations for everyone, and that nobody's too important to be held accountable." Robert checked his watch. "I have a call with our Tokyo investors in 20 minutes. Make sure the demonstration area is prepared for tomorrow. Nothing too technical, we don't want the poor man to hurt himself." As Robert walked away, he felt Nancy's disapproval radiating toward his back. He ignored it. You didn't build a billion-dollar company by worrying about hurt feelings. Sometimes people needed reminders of the natural order of things. That evening, as most employees filed out of the building, Victor Mendez remained. Security cameras would later show him requesting access to the company library, a privilege rarely used by non-technical staff but technically available to all employees. He spent 3 hours there reviewing technical manuals. In his expansive corner office, Robert was working late, finalizing his presentation for the board meeting later that week. A soft knock interrupted his concentration. "Come in," he called, not looking up from his computer. Nancy entered, placing a thin folder on his desk. Victor Mendez's employment file as requested. Robert hadn't actually requested it, but he understood Nancy's intent. She wanted him to see the janitor as a person, not just a prop for tomorrow's lesson. He flipped open the folder, scanning the sparse contents. Basic application, clean background check, consistent performance reviews, nothing remarkable. 7 years of emptying trash cans and mopping floors, Robert noted. And before that? "The file doesn't say," Nancy replied. His application listed various maintenance positions for the 10 years prior. Robert closed the folder. "Is there something specific you think I should know?" Nancy hesitated. "Just that people aren't always what they seem, sir. And tomorrow you might be the one learning a lesson." After she left, Robert found himself staring at the closed folder. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Then he shook it off. Tomorrow would play out exactly as he expected, and by afternoon, everyone would have forgotten about Victor Mendez and his momentary delusion of grandeur. What Robert couldn't know was that across town, in a small apartment, Victor Mendez sat at his kitchen table, calloused hands spread over technical diagrams he had drawn from memory. His eyes, tired but determined, moved methodically across the paper as he prepared for the challenge ahead. A challenge that would unravel secrets buried for years and change Skyline Aerospace forever. Word spread like wildfire through Skyline Aerospace overnight. By morning, the story of the CEO's challenge to the janitor had reached every department. The usual morning chatter in the break room centered on only one topic: Victor Mendez and his upcoming demonstration. "I've worked here 5 years and barely spoken 10 words to the guy," said Tom from accounting, stirring his coffee. Keeps to himself, always polite though. Parker's gone too far this time, Lisa from Human Resources whispered. It's one thing to push the engineering team, that's their job. But setting up a maintenance worker for public failure? That's just cruel. In the engineering department, Chief Engineer Diane Chen was less concerned with workplace politics and more worried about the practical implications. The TX5000 wasn't a toy. It was a complex piece of machinery worth millions in development. Costs. We need to set boundaries for this demonstration, she told her team as they prepared the testing bay. Nothing that could damage the prototype. Basic external inspection only. You really think he'll show up? Asked Raj, her assistant. If I were him, I'd have called in sick or quit. Diane shrugged. All I know is we're not risking our engine for some power play between Parker and the cleaning staff. Meanwhile, Victor arrived at work an hour earlier than usual. The night security guard nodded to him as he badged in, trying not to look too curious. Victor headed straight to the locker room, carrying an old duffel bag alongside his usual lunch container. Inside the empty locker room, Victor changed methodically. He removed his gray coveralls and placed them carefully on a hanger. From his duffel, he withdrew a crisp white button-down shirt and dark blue slacks. Simple clothes, but noticeably different from his work uniform. After changing, he stood before the small mirror above the sink, studying his reflection. His hands betrayed the slightest tremor as he smoothed down his shirt. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady, resolved. From the bag, he pulled out a small leather case worn with age. He slipped it into his pocket without opening it, then headed to his usual maintenance closet to begin his morning duties. In the executive suite, Robert Parker arrived earlier than usual as well. He found Nancy already at her desk, reviewing documents with a cup of tea beside her. You're here early, he commented, dropping his briefcase in his office before returning to her desk. Preparing for a busy day, she replied neutrally. The Tokyo investors were impressed with your presentation. They've moved up their timeline and want to see a demonstration of the TX5000 next month. Robert nodded, pleased. Good. We'll be ready. Anything else I should know about? Nancy hesitated, then pushed a folder across her desk. I did some more digging on Victor Mendez. Still worried about our little demonstration? Robert smirked. It'll be over in 10 minutes, and everyone can get back to work. His employment history has some gaps, Nancy continued, ignoring his dismissal. Before coming to Skyline, there's a period of almost 3 years where I can't find any record of employment. So he was between jobs. It happens. Before that, I can only find odd maintenance positions like his application stated. But here's what's strange. No references, no specifics about which companies. Just vague job descriptions. She tapped the folder. Don't you find that unusual for someone with his work ethic? 7 years here without a single disciplinary note or absence. Robert picked up the folder but didn't open it. What exactly are you suggesting, Nancy? Nothing specific. Just that there might be more to Victor Mendez than meets the eye. She glanced at her watch. It's almost 9. The testing bay is prepped. Half the company seems to have found reasons to be near there this morning. Of course they have, Robert said, dropping the folder back on her desk. Everyone loves a little drama. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do before our little show. As he walked away, Nancy called after him. Robert, he turned, surprised by her use of his first name. Just keep an open mind today. By 9:45, the testing bay was crowded with more people than it had ever held before. Engineers stood nearest to the engine, protective of their creation despite the circumstances. Middle managers and department heads lingered behind them, while administrative staff and other workers filled the back of the room and spilled into the hallway. Diane Chen had established a small restricted area around the TX5000, with bright yellow tape marking boundaries on the floor. The prototype sat in the center, partially disassembled as it had been the day before, its complex internal components visible through the opened access panels. At 9:55, Victor Mendez entered the room. A hush fell over the crowd as people nudged each other and whispered, He wore his clean white shirt and dark pants, looking more like someone arriving for a job interview than a man about to be humiliated. He carried nothing with him. No tools, no manuals, no notes. Victor nodded politely to several people as he made his way through the crowd. When he reached the yellow boundary tape, he stopped and waited, hands clasped before him, eyes fixed on the engine. At exactly 10 WQR, Robert Parker strode in through the main doors, accompanied by Nancy and 2 board members who happened to be visiting that day. He surveyed the crowd with mild surprise. "Quite the turnout," he murmured to Nancy. "Did you expect anything less?" she replied quietly. Robert approached the yellow tape, stopping a few feet from where Victor stood waiting. "Good morning, Victor," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ready for your demonstration?" Victor nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Well then," Robert gestured to the engine with a sweep of his hand. "Show us what you know about servicing the TX5000. Diane and her team will make sure you don't damage anything too expensive." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd. Diane stepped forward, her expression professional but her eyes sympathetic as she addressed Victor. "We've prepared basic access to the external components," she explained. "For safety reasons, we can't allow any major disassembly today. If you have questions before you begin—" "Thank you," Victor said quietly, "but I'm ready to start." His voice was soft but clear in the hushed room. "May I approach the engine?" Diane nodded, and Victor stepped carefully over the yellow line. The room grew completely silent as he walked slowly around the prototype, studying it from all angles without touching it. His examination was methodical, unhurried. After completing his circuit, Victor stopped and turned to Diane. "Do you have a standard toolkit available?" Surprised, she nodded to Raj, who brought forward a rolling cart with various tools arranged neatly on top. Victor studied the tools, then selected a pen light and a small mirror mounted on a telescoping handle. Basic inspection tools. He approached the open access panel and leaned in, using the light and mirror to examine areas not visible from the outside. Robert checked his watch pointedly. 5 minutes had passed with Victor doing nothing but looking at the engine. He caught Nancy's eye and raised an eyebrow as if to say, "See? Just as I expected." Then Victor straightened up and turned to Diane. "May I use your diagnostic tablet?" Diane blinked in surprise. "The diagnostic interface is proprietary. It requires security clearance to Level 3 access should be sufficient for basic readings," Victor said calmly. "I don't need to modify any settings, just confirm what I'm seeing." The engineering team exchanged glances. The terms Victor had used were correct, specific to their systems. Hesitantly, Diane handed over her tablet. The crowd murmured as Victor confidently entered a series of commands, navigating the complex interface with surprising ease. He studied the readings for a moment, then returned to the engine with the tablet in hand. "Your compression ratios are fluctuating in the secondary chamber," he said to Diane, pointing to specific numbers on the screen. "That suggests a microfracture or misalignment in one of the compressor blades." Diane took the tablet back, frowning as she checked the readings. "That's correct. We've been tracking a minor inconsistency, but haven't pinpointed the cause. May I?" Victor gestured to the tool cart again. Now genuinely curious, Diane nodded. Victor selected several more specialized tools, then positioned himself beside a different access panel. "This section would need to be removed to properly inspect the compressor assembly," he said, pointing to a specific panel that was still sealed. "With your permission?" The room had grown so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning seemed loud by comparison. All eyes turned to Robert, whose confident expression had faltered slightly. "Go ahead," Robert said after a moment, "since you seem to know what you're talking about." With steady hands that no longer trembled at all, Victor began to carefully remove the access panel, using exactly the right tools in precisely the right sequence. His movements were practiced, efficient, the motions of someone who had performed this task many times before. As the panel came free, revealing the complex compressor assembly beneath, Victor finally reached into his pocket and withdrew the small leather case he had brought with him. He opened it to reveal a set of precision measuring instruments, not the standard tools one would find in a maintenance kit, but specialized equipment used by design engineers. "These are mine," he said simply, answering the unasked question. "I've had them for a long time." The whispers started again, louder this time as Victor bent to his task with the calm assurance of an expert. Robert and Nancy exchanged a look, and for the first time that morning, Robert Parker looked genuinely confused. Something unexpected was happening, and the carefully scripted humiliation he had planned was unraveling before his eyes. As Victor continued his inspection with professional precision, the truth was becoming increasingly clear to everyone in the room. The janitor knew exactly what he was doing. The testing bay had fallen into a stunned silence as Victor worked. His weathered hands moved with surprising grace among the complex components of the TX-5000 engine. Engineers who had come expecting a show of incompetence now crowded closer, their professional curiosity overtaking their previous skepticism. Diane Chen stood just behind Victor, watching his every move with growing amazement. When he pointed to a specific section of the compressor assembly, she leaned in to look. "There," Victor said quietly. "Do you see it?" Diane squinted, then her eyes widened. "The microfracture. It's exactly where the diagnostic readings suggested." She turned to Raj. "Get me the high-resolution camera. We need to document this." As Raj hurried away, Victor continued his inspection, using his personal measuring tools with practiced ease. He made small notations on a pad Diane had provided, occasionally pausing to consult the diagnostic tablet. From the edge of the yellow tape, Robert Parker watched with an increasingly furrowed brow. This was not how the morning was supposed to unfold. The janitor, the man who mopped floors and emptied trash bins, was handling one of the most advanced jet engines in the world with the confidence of a seasoned professional. "What's happening?" Robert murmured to Nancy, who stood beside him. "I believe," she replied softly, "that we're all learning something today." As the minutes stretched on, the whispers in the room grew louder. People were checking their phones, searching for information. The two board members who had accompanied Robert were engaged in a hushed conversation, occasionally glancing at Victor with obvious interest. After nearly 30 minutes of methodical inspection, Victor straightened up and turned to address Diane directly. "The microfracture extends approximately 0.8 millimeters along the trailing edge of the third compressor blade," he explained, pointing to his notes. "It's small, but under high-stress conditions it would propagate quickly. The vibration patterns would eventually affect the entire assembly." Diane studied his notes, her expression growing more impressed by the second. "This is exactly what we've been trying to pinpoint for weeks. How did you—" "There's more," Victor continued. "Your fuel flow regulator is calibrated at factory standard, but with the modified intake design you're using, you're losing efficiency. A 3% adjustment would optimize the air-fuel mixture for your specific configuration." One of the younger engineers spoke up. "That's what I've been saying for months. The standard calibration doesn't account for our custom intake geometry." Diane silenced him with a look, then turned back to Victor. "These are very specific observations, Mr. Mendez. The kind that only someone with extensive engineering knowledge would make." The room fell silent again as all eyes turned to Victor. For the first time since the demonstration began, he looked uncomfortable. "I've worked around engines for a long time," he said simply. Robert stepped forward, crossing the yellow line. "I think we deserve more of an explanation than that." His voice had lost its earlier smugness, replaced by genuine confusion. "You're not just a janitor, are you?" Victor met Robert's gaze steadily. "I am a janitor. That's my job here at Skyline." "But before that," Robert pressed. Before Victor could answer, one of the board members stepped forward. Walter Griffith was in his 70s, a veteran of the aerospace industry who had been with Skyline since before Robert took over. "My God," Walter said, staring at Victor. "It's you, isn't it? Victor Mendez." He turned to the room. "Victor Mendez from Westland Aviation." A murmur ran through the crowd. Westland was one of their biggest competitors, known for their innovative engine designs in the 1990s and early 2000s. Victor's shoulders sagged slightly, as if a weight he'd been carrying had suddenly grown heavier. "That was a long time ago, Mr. Griffith. 20 years at least," Walter agreed. "But I never forget a face or a brilliant engineer." He turned to Robert. "This man designed the M80 engine series that revolutionized fuel efficiency standards. His work is still cited in technical journals today." The crowd erupted in whispers. Diane looked at Victor with new eyes, recognition dawning on her face. "The Mendez compression system," she breathed. "We studied your designs in graduate school, but the articles said you'd left the industry. There were rumors." Victor's face had gone very still. "Yes, I left." Robert looked from Walter to Victor, clearly struggling to process this revelation. "If you're who they say you are, why on earth are you working as a janitor at Skyline?" For a long moment, Victor said nothing. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room, because sometimes the only way to make peace with the past is to step away from it completely. He carefully placed his measuring tools back in their leather case. "The inspection is complete. The fracture should be addressed before any further testing, and I'd recommend reconsidering the fuel regulator calibration." He nodded to Diane. "Your team does excellent work. The TX5000 is a remarkable design." As Victor turned to leave, Robert stepped into his path. "Wait, you can't just walk away after this. If you're really Victor Mendez, if you really designed those engines, then what?" Victor asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "Does it change? The fact that I'm your janitor. Does it change how you spoke to me yesterday?" Robert had the grace to look uncomfortable. "No, but it changes what happens next." He glanced around at the crowd of employees, all watching intently. "My office. Please, we should talk privately." Victor hesitated, then nodded once. As they made their way toward the door, the crowd parted before them, faces filled with confusion, curiosity, and a new respect when they looked at Victor. Nancy fell into step beside them, followed by Walter Griffith and Diane. The rest of the employees remained in the testing bay, erupting into excited conversation the moment the door closed behind the small group. In Robert's spacious office, Victor stood quietly near the window, looking out at the vast skyline complex spread below. The others settled into chairs, but Victor remained standing as if ready to leave at any moment. "Why don't you start at the beginning?" Robert suggested, his voice carefully neutral. "How does one of the most brilliant engine designers in the industry end up mopping floors at Skyline?" Victor turned from the window. For the first time, real emotion showed on his face, a deep sadness mixed with something harder to define. "You know about the Westland test failure," he said. It wasn't a question. Walter nodded solemnly. "The XJ40 prototype. Catastrophic failure during high-stress testing. 2 technicians killed, millions in damage. I was the lead designer." Victor said quietly. "It was my engine, my responsibility." "But the investigation cleared you completely," Walter protested. "The failure was traced to a manufacturing defect in a component from an outside supplier. Your design was sound. That didn't bring Tom and Hector back to their families." Victor's voice was hollow. "They had children, wives. They trusted my design with their lives." Nancy leaned forward. "So you left Westland?" "I left everything," Victor corrected. "After the funerals, after the investigations, after the lawyers. I couldn't do it anymore. Every time I looked at an engine, I saw their faces." "But why become a janitor?" Robert asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "You could have taught, consulted, worked in another field entirely." Victor's gaze was steady. "Because I needed to be near them." "Near who?" Diane asked softly. "The engines," Victor replied. "I couldn't design them anymore, couldn't bear that responsibility. But I couldn't stay away either. They were my life's work." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "So I found a way to be close to them, to watch over them. without having to make decisions that might cost lives. I've worked at 5 different aerospace companies over the years, always in maintenance, always invisible. Until yesterday, Robert said. Victor nodded. Until yesterday. A heavy silence fell over the room. Through the large windows, they could see workers returning to their stations across the complex. Many, in small groups talking animatedly. Word was spreading throughout Skyline. What happens now? Nancy asked, looking from Victor to Robert. Before Robert could answer, Victor spoke up. Nothing changes. I'll finish my shift today like always. And tomorrow I'll be back to clean the floors and empty the trash. That's ridiculous, Robert said flatly. You're Victor Mendez. You should be working in our engineering department, not the janitorial staff. I told you, Victor said, his voice firm. I don't design engines anymore. Then consult, teach, mentor. Robert stood, suddenly energized. Do you have any idea what your knowledge could mean for our young engineers, for the TX 5000 project? He shook his head. I'm not letting a mind like yours waste away pushing a mop, Mr. Mendez. Victor studied Robert's face as if searching for something. Yesterday I was beneath your notice. Today I'm suddenly valuable. The only thing that's changed is what you know about my past. Robert had the decency to flush. You're right. I behaved poorly. I made assumptions based on your job title, not your abilities or character. That was my mistake, and I apologize. For the first time, genuine surprise showed on Victor's face. He clearly hadn't expected an apology. Walter Griffith cleared his throat. Victor, the industry lost something precious when you walked away. I understand your reasons, who wouldn't? But perhaps there's a middle path. A way for you to share your wisdom without bearing the full weight of design responsibility. Victor turned back to the window, his reflection thoughtful in the glass. Below, the massive Skyline complex continued its daily rhythm, unaware that upstairs in the CEO's office, a moment of transformation was unfolding, for Victor Mendez, for Robert Parker, and for the future of Skyline Aerospace itself. News traveled fast at Skyline Aerospace. By lunchtime, every employee knew that Victor Mendez wasn't just a janitor. He was Victor Mendez, the legendary engine designer whose innovations had changed aviation 2 decades ago. The cafeteria buzzed with excited conversations, theories, and retold versions of what had happened in the testing bay that morning. Meanwhile, in a small conference room adjacent to Robert's office, a different kind of meeting was taking place. Nancy had ordered in lunch, and now sandwiches and coffee sat mostly untouched on the table as Victor spoke about his past for the first time in years. After the accident, I stayed for the investigation, he explained. I owed the families that much. 3 months of tests, analysis, questioning. In the end, they traced the failure to a substandard bearing that had passed inspection but contained microscopic flaws. I remember the industry fallout, Walter said. Westland's supplier was found liable. New safety protocols were implemented across the board. Victor nodded. But Tom and Hector were still gone. I attended both funerals, looked their families in the eyes. He paused, the memory clearly painful. Hector's youngest daughter was only 4. She asked me if I could fix her daddy like I fixed the engines. The room fell silent. Robert, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. So you disappeared? I needed distance, Victor replied. I handed in my resignation, sold my house, and moved across the country. Took odd jobs for a while. Eventually, I found myself working maintenance at an airfield in Arizona, being near planes again, but not responsible for them. It helped, somehow. And then you started working at aerospace companies, Diane said. As a janitor. It wasn't a plan, Victor said with a slight shrug. But yes, first at Meridian Systems, then Orbital Dynamics, then here at Skyline. 7 years now. 7 years, Robert repeated, shaking his head. Walking past our engineers every day, seeing their mistakes, their innovations, and never saying a word. It wasn't my place, Victor said simply. Until yesterday, Nancy observed. A ghost of a smile touched Victor's lips. Until yesterday. Robert leaned forward, elbows on the table. I owe you another apology, Mr. Mendez, not just for yesterday's challenge, but for failing to recognize what was right in front of me for 7 years. You weren't looking for an engine designer mopping your floors, Victor said without bitterness. No, Robert agreed. I wasn't. He glanced at Nancy, whose expression remained neutral but whose eyes held a clear, I told you so message. The question is, what happens now? Before Victor could answer, there was a knock at the door. Raj poked his head in, looking apologetic for the interruption. Sorry, Ms. Chen, but we've fully examined the compressor blade Mr. Mendez identified. His eyes darted to Victor with newfound respect. The fracture is worse than we initially thought. It's extending into the attachment point. Diane frowned. If that had failed during high RPM testing. Catastrophic failure, Victor finished quietly. Like Westland. The weight of those words hung in the air. Robert looked from Diane to Victor, his expression grave. How long will repairs take? He asked. With the current design? At least 2 weeks, Diane said. We'll need to fabricate a replacement blade, recalibrate the entire assembly. The Tokyo investors won't wait that long, Robert said. They're expecting a demonstration in 3 weeks. Victor, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. There might be another approach. All eyes turned to him. For a moment he seemed to struggle internally, as if crossing some invisible line. Then he reached for a napkin and a pen from the table. The problem isn't just the fractured blade, he said, sketching rapidly. It's the design of the attachment point. Too much stress concentration here. His pen moved quickly, laying out a modified design. If you reconfigure the mounting this way, you distribute the load more evenly. It would prevent similar fractures in the future. Diane moved closer, studying the sketch. That's brilliant. Simple, but effective. She looked up at Victor. Would you be willing to work with my team on this? Just as a consultant, she added quickly, seeing his hesitation. No design responsibility, just guidance. Victor stared at the sketch he'd just made, his first design work in nearly 15 years. His hand trembled slightly as he set down the pen. I don't know if I can, he said honestly. Robert studied him for a long moment. Tell me something, Mr. Mendez. Yesterday, when you were looking at the TX5000, before I interrupted you, what were you thinking? Victor's eyes grew distant. I was admiring the intake geometry. It's elegant, efficient. But I noticed the vibration patterns in the housing and suspected something wasn't quite right with the compressor assembly. And you cared, Robert said. Even as a janitor, you cared about that engine. Victor met his gaze. I've always cared. That's the problem. No, Robert said firmly. That's the solution. He gestured to the sketch. This isn't just about saving our timeline with the investors. It's about making a safer engine. Isn't that what Tom and Hector would have wanted? For you to use your gift to protect others? Victor flinched at the mention of the technicians' names. That's not fair. Maybe not, Robert admitted. But I think it's true. The room fell silent again. Finally, Walter spoke up. Victor, I knew you back then. Not well, but we met at industry events. You were never arrogant about your talents like some designers. You genuinely wanted to make flying safer, more efficient. The older man leaned forward. The accident was a tragedy, but your disappearance, that was a loss for aviation safety. How many improvements, how many innovations have we missed because you've been pushing a mop instead of pushing the boundaries of design? Victor stood abruptly. I need some air. Without waiting for a response, he left the room. Through the glass walls, they watched him walk to the end of the hallway and stop at the large windows overlooking the manufacturing floor. His shoulders were tense, his posture rigid. Was that too much pressure? Diane asked worriedly. Maybe, Nancy said. But sometimes pressure is necessary for transformation. She gave Robert a pointed look. Something our CEO knows all about. Robert acknowledged her comment with a nod, then stood. I should talk to him, alone. He found Victor still at the window, gazing down at the workers below. The TX-5000 was visible in the distance, engineers swarming around it like doctors attending a patient. When I was 32, Robert said without preamble, I made a decision that cost Skyline $8 million and nearly bankrupted the company. Victor glanced at him, surprised by the confession. It was my first year as CEO, Robert continued. I was desperate to prove myself, to show I deserved this position. I pushed forward with a project that more experienced voices warned me against. He shook his head. I was so certain I knew better. What happened? Victor asked. Reality happened. The project failed spectacularly. We had to lay off 20% of our workforce. Robert's face tightened at the memory. I still remember signing those termination notices. People with families, mortgages, children in college. That's different from what happened at Westland, Victor said quietly. Yes and no, Robert replied. No one died, thank God. But lives were still affected. People still suffered because of my choices. He turned to face Victor directly. The point is, I had two options afterward. I could resign in disgrace, walk away, or I could stay, learn from my mistake, and try to rebuild what I'd damaged. You stayed, Victor observed. I stayed, Robert confirmed. It was harder than leaving would have been, facing those same employees every day, knowing what I'd done. But eventually we turned things around, created new jobs, brought back as many laid-off workers as we could. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the activity below. Your situation with Westland, it's different, I know, Robert finally said. The stakes were higher, the trauma deeper. I can't imagine carrying that burden for 15 years. He paused. But I do know something about guilt and responsibility, and the different ways we can respond to failure. Victor's voice was barely audible. I'm afraid. The simple admission seemed to cost him greatly. Robert was struck by the vulnerability of this brilliant man who had hidden himself away for so long. Of making another mistake? Robert asked. Victor nodded. Every time I look at an engine design, I see possibilities for failure, points of weakness, potential disasters. His hands gripped the window ledge. It's paralyzing. Yet you spotted that fracture immediately, Robert pointed out. Your instincts protected us from a potential failure today. Before Victor could respond, Nancy approached from down the hallway. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but Diane's team has a question about the modification sketch. She looked at Victor. Only if you're willing. Victor took a deep breath, then released it slowly. Just consulting, he said, as if reminding himself of the boundaries. Not designing. Just consulting, Nancy confirmed, as they walked back toward the conference room. Robert noticed something different in Victor's posture, a slight straightening of the shoulders, a purpose in his step that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but unmistakable. In the conference room, Diane had spread out detailed technical drawings of the TX-5000 compressor assembly. Several engineers, including Raj, had joined them, their expressions a mix of curiosity and reverence, as Victor entered. Mr. Mendez, Diane began, we've been discussing your modification concept. She pointed to a section of the drawing. We have concerns about the thermal expansion rates with the new attachment design. At maximum operating temperature, Victor studied the drawings for a moment, then reached for a pencil. With surprising confidence, he began to annotate the design, explaining as he worked. If you incorporate a floating collar here, with these tolerances you accommodate the expansion without creating new stress points. The engineers crowded closer, watching intently. The hesitation that had marked Victor minutes earlier seemed to fade as he immersed himself in the familiar world of technical problems and elegant solutions. From the doorway, Robert watched the transformation with satisfaction. He caught Nancy's eye and nodded slightly. They both recognized what was happening, the rebirth of an engineer, the awakening of a dormant passion. What had begun as a cruel challenge was becoming something neither of them could have predicted. A second chance, not just for Victor Mendez, but perhaps for Skyline Aerospace as well. 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity at Skyline Aerospace. The TX5000 engine project, which had been progressing steadily for months, now advanced with remarkable speed. What had begun as a simple modification to fix a fractured compressor blade had evolved into something more significant, a series of subtle but powerful improvements that enhanced both safety and performance. At the center of this transformation was Victor Mendez. Though he had initially agreed only to consult on the compressor blade issue, his involvement gradually expanded. Each day he spent more time in the engineering department and less time with his mop and cleaning cart. The arrangement was unusual. Victor still wore his maintenance uniform and officially remained part of the janitorial staff. But now, when he finished his cleaning duties in the morning, he would change into a white shirt and slacks and join Diane's team in the development lab. On the morning of the Tokyo investors' visit, the testing bay hummed with nervous energy. Engineers made final adjustments to the TX5000, which gleamed under the bright lights. Executives in formal business attire reviewed presentation materials, while technical staff ran through safety protocols one last time. Robert Parker stood near the entrance, checking his watch. "They'll be here in 20 minutes. Where's Victor?" Nancy, elegant in a tailored suit, consulted her tablet. "Still in the maintenance area according to his badge scan. Want me to call him?" Robert shook his head. "No, I'll go." He found Victor in the janitor's closet, methodically organizing cleaning supplies. The small room smelled of lemon-scented disinfectant and industrial floor wax. Victor looked up as Robert appeared in the doorway. "The investors will be here soon," Robert said. Victor nodded, placing a bottle of glass cleaner on a shelf. "The testing bay is ready. I finished cleaning it an hour ago." "That's not why I'm here." Robert leaned against the doorframe. "Diane's team is asking for you. There are last-minute questions about the fuel flow adjustments." Victor wiped his hands on a cloth. "I've already told them everything they need to know. They're more than capable of handling the demonstration." "That's not the point." Robert studied the older man carefully. "You belong in that room, Victor. Not just as a consultant. Not just as the janitor who surprised everyone with his hidden knowledge, but as a key contributor to the project." Victor continued organizing supplies, his movements deliberate, almost meditative. "I'm comfortable with my role here." "Are you?" Robert challenged. "Because I've watched you these past 3 weeks. When you're working with the engineering team, you come alive. Your eyes light up. Your whole demeanor changes. You're in your element." Victor's hands stilled. "And when the demonstration is over today, what then?" "That's up to you." Robert straightened from the doorway. "But I think you already know what you want. You're just afraid to admit it." For a long moment, Victor said nothing. Then he closed the supply cabinet and turned to face Robert, fully. "For 15 years I've defined myself by what happened at Westland," he said quietly. "By my failure. By Tom and Hector's deaths. It became my identity. The brilliant designer who walked away because he couldn't handle the responsibility." "And now?" Robert prompted. "Now?" Victor looked down at his hands, calloused from years of manual labor but still possessing the precision that had made him a legendary engineer. "Now I'm not sure who I am anymore." Robert nodded, understanding. "When I found out who you really were, I thought I'd discovered your secret. But that wasn't it, was it? The real secret is that you never stopped being an engineer. You just stopped believing you deserved to be one." Victor flinched slightly at the truth in those words. "The investors will be here soon," Robert said again, softer this time. "Whatever you decide, know that there's a place for you at Skyline, whether that's in maintenance or engineering or something in between." He checked his watch. 15 minutes. As Robert turned to leave, Victor called after him. "Do you think it's possible to start over, after so much time?" Robert paused in the doorway. 3 weeks ago, I thought you were just a janitor who needed to be put in his place. Today, you're one of the most valuable minds at Skyline." He smiled slightly. If that's not starting over, I don't know what is. After Robert left, Victor stood alone in the small closet, surrounded by the tools of a trade he had adopted but never truly embraced. Through the small window, he could see the vast manufacturing floor, where the future of aviation was being shaped every day. With sudden decision, he reached for his duffel bag on the shelf. The Japanese investors arrived precisely on time. 6 serious-looking businessmen in dark suits accompanied by their own technical experts. Robert and Nancy greeted them in the lobby, exchanging formal bows and business cards before leading them toward the testing bay. "We are particularly interested in the efficiency improvements you mentioned," said Mr. Tanaka, the head of the delegation. "If the TX-5000 can deliver the 15% reduction in fuel consumption you claim, it would be very significant for our new aircraft development." "I believe you'll be impressed by what you see today," Robert assured him. "Our team has actually exceeded those initial projections." As they entered the testing bay, the investors murmured appreciatively at the sight of the TX-5000. The engine had been mounted on a specialized testing rig that would allow for a controlled demonstration of its capabilities without the need for a full aircraft. Diane Chen stepped forward to begin the technical presentation. She had just launched into her introduction when the door at the far end of the bay opened. Victor Mendez entered, but not in his usual maintenance uniform. He wore a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, with a Skyline Aerospace badge clipped to his pocket. Not a visitor badge or contractor badge, but a full employee ID. In his hands, he carried a small leather-bound notebook. A subtle smile crossed Diane's face as she saw him. "And joining us for the presentation is Victor Mendez, our special technical advisor on the TX-5000 project." The Japanese delegation showed polite interest, unaware of the significant glances being exchanged among the Skyline employees. As Victor took his place beside Diane, Robert caught his eye and nodded slightly in approval. The demonstration proceeded flawlessly. The TX-5000 performed exactly as predicted, its modified components working in perfect harmony. When the technical portion concluded, Mr. Tanaka asked several pointed questions about the engine's design innovations. "These modifications to the compressor assembly," he said, pointing to a technical diagram, "they are quite elegant, not what we expected based on previous Skyline designs." Diane glanced at Victor, who stepped forward with quiet confidence. "The modifications were inspired by 2 competing needs," he explained, his voice steady. "Enhancing performance while simultaneously improving safety margins by redistributing stress loads here and here," he indicated points on the diagram. "We've achieved both objectives without adding weight or complexity." Mr. Tanaka studied Victor with new interest. "Your approach reminds me of the Mendez compression system from Westland's earlier designs. Are you familiar with that work?" A murmur ran through the Skyline team. Victor met the investor's gaze directly. "Yes," he said simply. "I am familiar with it." Understanding dawned on Mr. Tanaka's face. "You are that Mendez? Victor Mendez from Westland?" Victor nodded. "Yes." The Japanese delegation exchanged glances, clearly impressed. Mr. Tanaka bowed deeply. "It is an honor. Your work on thermal efficiency was groundbreaking." As the presentation concluded and the group moved toward the conference room for further discussions, Robert fell into step beside Victor. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" he asked quietly. "Terrifying," Victor admitted with a small smile. "But also..." Right. Later that afternoon, after the investors had departed with promises of continued partnership, Robert called a company-wide meeting in the main auditorium. Employees filed in, curious about the unexpected announcement. Robert took the stage, waiting for the room to settle before speaking. "Today marks an important day for Skyline Aerospace," he began. "Not just because our demonstration for the Tokyo group was successful, though it certainly was." Scattered applause broke out. "But because today represents something more meaningful. A reminder that we should never make assumptions about the people around us or the contributions they can make." The room grew quiet as employees sensed something significant was coming. 3 weeks ago, I made a terrible error in judgment," Robert continued, his voice carrying clearly through the space. "I saw a janitor looking at an engine and I assumed. He couldn't possibly understand what he was seeing. I was wrong. He gestured to the side of the stage where Victor stood. Many of you now know that Victor Mendez is actually one of the most brilliant engine designers in aviation history. What you may not know is that for the past 3 weeks he has been helping us transform the TX5000 from a good engine into an exceptional one, all while continuing to work in our maintenance department. Victor walked slowly onto the stage, looking somewhat uncomfortable with the attention but standing tall nonetheless. Today I'm pleased to announce 2 new initiatives at Skyline, Robert said. First, the creation of the Mendez Innovation Lab, a new division that will focus on safety and efficiency improvements across all our projects. Victor has agreed to lead this team, drawing on his unique perspective and extraordinary talent. Applause erupted louder this time. Victor nodded in acknowledgement, a faint flush on his cheeks. The second initiative, Robert continued when the noise subsided, is what we're calling the Full Spectrum Contribution Program. This company-wide effort will create pathways for every Skyline employee, regardless of position or department, to contribute ideas and expertise beyond their job descriptions. Because if we've learned anything these past weeks, it's that breakthrough thinking can come from anywhere. As the meeting concluded and employees began to file out, many stopped to congratulate Victor or shake his hand. The man who had been invisible for years was now the center of attention, something that clearly still made him uncomfortable, but which he accepted with quiet dignity. Nancy approached Robert as he watched the scene from the side of the stage. Quite a turnaround from the janitor needs to be put in his place, she observed. Robert chuckled. Sometimes the best leadership lessons come from your worst moments. So what happens to Victor's maintenance position? She asked. Filled as of this morning, Robert replied. Though interestingly, Victor has requested that his new office be located near the maintenance area. Says he finds the smell of lemon cleaner conducive to clear thinking. He shook his head, smiling. And he's keeping his cleaning cart, says some of his best ideas come while mopping. Across the room, Victor was deep in conversation with Diane and several engineers, his hands moving animatedly as he explained a concept. For the first time since coming to Skyline, he looked truly at home. You know, Nancy said thoughtfully, when you issued that challenge 3 weeks ago, I thought you were making a terrible mistake. I was, Robert admitted. Yes, she agreed. But sometimes mistakes turn out to be exactly what everyone needs. The auditorium emptied, Victor glanced up and caught Robert's eye across the room. The 2 men exchanged a nod of mutual respect. The CEO who had learned to look beyond titles and appearances, and the janitor who had found his way back to his true calling. Some secrets once revealed change everything.